In Total War Saga Troy, you'll be conquering new lands, commanding massive armies, and leading your people to prosperity against the backdrop of the epic and legendary tale of the Trojan War. With control over everything from what you build in your cities to your tactics on the battlefield, Total War Saga Troy has a lot of systems that are easy to learn but challenging to master. Over the course of 3 videos, we're going to cover the basics of how to govern your people, how to command your troops, and how to dominate the battlefield. In this video, we'll explore some key elements and tactics to take advantage of on the battlefield to ensure that you won't simply be a capable commander, but a truly dominant one. The value of morale. There's more than one way to defeat the enemy. Killing each and every one of them is certainly an option, though it can be far more efficient to break them instead. Morale is the true health bar of any unit, and though you will sometimes find yourself facing unbreakable units that will fight to the death instead, most units you will do battle with are susceptible to morale damage. When the morale of these units drops below 0, they have a chance to break and rout. This means they will try and make their way off the battlefield, avoiding any other engagements. This doesn't mean they've been entirely taken care of, though. It's possible that they'll rout right off the battlefield, especially if the rout began close to the edge, and if you keep chasing routing units, you can typically chase them off the field, but oftentimes, the routing unit will rally and will rejoin the battle, and only by applying constant pressure and by breaking the same unit a few times will you see them shatter completely. This means they will not return to the battle under any circumstances, and for all intents and purposes, you can stop paying them any attention. The only time it makes sense to completely eliminate a shattered unit in a battle is if leaving it alive will pose a threat in a future battle on the campaign. After all, surviving units have technically lived to fight another day, though if you have the troops to spare as the enemy units flee, feel free to chase them down and finish them off anyway. But how do you get troops to lose morale? The easiest way is simply by causing damage. A hurt unit is likely to give up on the fight if the damage taken is beyond a certain threshold, and the more damage they've taken, the bigger that debuff. So if you focus down on one unit with a lot of attention, say from archers early on, it'll be quicker to give up. On which note, a unit under ranged fire will suffer morale loss for that as well, whether the shots are causing a lot of damage or not, and whether the shots are being fired by friend or foe. Friendly fire is a concern for morale damage as well. When a unit is losing its current engagement, it'll suffer a drop in morale as well, and depending on how poorly it's doing, that drop will be more significant. And when a unit is near enemy units that are simply better than them and provide a serious threat, you'll see morale loss as well. Approaching a unit from the flanks will reduce its morale as it senses its flanks are exposed, and striking from the side or the rear will give a huge hit to morale too. The sides and rear count as separate flanks, so these morale debuffs can stack, and a strike from a rear does a lot more damage than a strike to the side, though doing both at once is the best approach. Beyond that, being struck by artillery or an equivalent ability, like a Cyclops tossing a boulder at a unit, will cause morale damage as well, whether the damage, again, comes from friend or foe, and being around a unit that specifically causes fear will cause a unit to falter as well. When the general of an army routs, all the units in that army susceptible to morale damage will take a small hit, and if the general dies, that hit is significantly worse. A good reason to target enemy generals early on. And finally, when enough friendly units are routing, units will start to lose morale as they see their friends giving up on the fight. These are what cause chain routes or mass routes, where if you can get enough enemy units to run for their lives, the entire army will soon start to crumble and flee. Good ways to protect against morale damage include staying near the general or near a unit that has the encourage ability, keeping flanks secure, taking on engagements that you're not likely to lose, and in fact, taking on engagements that you're likely to win, and charging. That's right. Charging gives units a major boost to morale, and though it's only temporary, it can keep a unit in the fight for longer than it otherwise would have stayed. Morale is a key element on the battlefield, and you should learn how to maintain the morale of your troops while also crushing that of your enemies. The most consistent tool at your disposal, however, will always be a flanking maneuver. How and when to flank. The hammer and anvil is a classic and basic military tactic. Use frontline infantry to hold the enemy in place, acting as the anvil, and bring in a thunderous charge of cavalry from the flank or rear, acting as the hammer, crushing the enemy in more ways than one. But the battlefields of Total War Saga Troy are from a time when cavalry wasn't an entirely common sight, and though you're certainly able to execute the maneuver with chariots and the occasional cavalry unit, you'll find yourself in trouble early on if you're simply waiting for those units to become available before you start using the single most effective battlefield maneuver: flanking. Flanking is helpful not just in melee, but also from range. It helps you cause more damage to an enemy, and it helps you break their will to fight, as discussed earlier. Most units will be susceptible to the effects of being flanked, and all units can be used to pull off a flanking attack, but pay close attention to the unit weight, traits, and abilities. Light units can move very quickly, and though they might not be the most damage-dealing of units, they can still move in and out of enemy flanks quickly, striking from the sides and the rear, and retreating quickly to safety. In many ways, light units can be thought of as an alternative to cavalry as far as their flanking and maneuverability is concerned. Beyond that, some units are particularly good at attacking from the flanks, increasing the effects of the maneuver, while other units are immune to the effects of being flanked, meaning they won't suffer any additional morale damage from being hit from the sides or the rear, and some units, as mentioned earlier, are completely unbreakable, meaning no morale damage can be inflicted, including that which comes from flanking. Eventually, you'll start to memorize which units are better at flanking and which are better at resisting a flanking maneuver, but it's always a good idea to keep a lookout for these icons. Make sure your standard frontline units are holding the enemy in place, and bring those particularly effective flankers in from the sides and the rears to break the enemy quickly. On the defensive, keep your units that can effectively defend against a flank on either end of your army there to hold off any clever maneuvers from your enemy. It's important to note, however, that even though a unit might be able to defend against the morale damage that comes with being flanked, they will still suffer from the added damage per second. A fully surrounded unit has more of its individuals engaged in combat, which means it might be more quickly killed off, whether it's particularly susceptible to flanking attacks or not. Flanking, as mentioned earlier, is also helpful with ranged units. Many units in Total War Saga Troy will come to the battlefield with shields, and by default, shields protect their bearer from any ranged shots coming from the front with a block chance. This protective region can be swapped out to block shots from the rear for certain units, but most will only ever be blocking forward. Sometimes, the shield block effectiveness is extremely low, but at other times, a whopping 60 or more % of ranged fire will end up blocked and wasted. In these circumstances, it's a good idea to send your ranged units behind the enemy and fire directly into their backs or sides, completely ignoring their shields and quickly whittling them down. It's a risky maneuver since ranged units don't stand much of a chance in melee more often than not, but it can really pay off if done well, and if you're quick to retreat them at the first sign of danger. Use the terrain. Whether it's for setting up a flanking maneuver, an ambush, or a tactical retreat, make sure you use the battlefield itself as an added tool in your arsenal. The battlefields in Total War Saga Troy are a reflection of where the engagement is taking place on the campaign map, and they are extremely varied in layout and strategic value. Right from deployment, where you can place units within your deployment zone or in a larger area if they have the appropriate trait, you should plan to use the terrain to your advantage if possible. Line of sight means you can effectively hide units behind hills and escarpments, and with a little bit of micromanagement, you can keep troops well hidden this way until it's time for them to pounce. This is an excellent and simple way to ambush the enemy or otherwise flank them for the benefits discussed earlier. Beyond just using height to hide, though, you can also take advantage of the ground itself. Most terrain is pretty simple, flat land, but looking around, you'll find the opportunity to hide units in the woods, tuck them away in tall grass, or use mud to trap your enemies. Units that are able to hide in various terrain will have it marked on their unit card, and then it's just a matter of either deploying or otherwise placing them within that terrain. A little icon on their unit card will confirm that the enemy can't see them, but be careful. Once the enemy gets close enough, the unit will be spotted. Beyond hiding spots, you should also keep in mind the impact that terrain has on speed and how it relates to the weight of your unit. The heavier a unit is, the more adversely it will be affected by things like grass and especially mud, slowing them down, allowing faster units to get away or maneuver around them. Cavalry and chariots are additionally slowed down by forests since they're typically not able to navigate them as cleanly as flat terrain, and infantry is typically adversely affected when fighting while standing in shallow water, hurting their melee capabilities. Using the terrain to your advantage can make the difference between a successful engagement, a clever flanking maneuver, a well-played ambush, or an uphill struggle. The importance of fatigue. On the topic of uphill struggles, try not to have too many of them. Fatigue is a key factor on the battlefields of Troy, and almost all actions will take a toll on your units. Though the game keeps some of the details a little hidden, the stats most affected by fatigue include melee attack, melee defense, and speed, with charge bonus, morale, and reload speed being added into the mix further down the line, and armor eventually taking a hit too when tired enough. And as fatigue gets worse, the stats affected early in the chain get worse the further down the chain you go as well. This means that the more tired a unit is, the tougher time it will have getting to where it needs to be, and when it gets there, it'll be performing a lot worse. Fatigue can be seen on the unit status icon bar or by hovering over the unit, and as a quick read of the gradients, neon green is good, orange is troubling, and red is bad. Over the course of the multiple steps of fatigue, a unit will perform worse, as described earlier, and it can sometimes be wise to let a unit retreat and rest, or to otherwise hold a unit in reserve and send it in when the enemy is tired. Recuperating lost fatigue isn't always an option, however, as once the fighting starts, it can be difficult if not impossible to pull a unit away safely. So you're much better off trying to minimize fatigue to begin with by avoiding the things that cause it. Sending your troops running everywhere seems not to make much of a difference, but it will add up over time. Try to march troops from time to time instead, rather than ordering constant running. Going uphill will tire troops out faster depending on how steep the climb is, and while climbing ladders is a quick way to get over city walls, it is a very exhausting endeavor and will almost completely tire your troops out by the time the act is done. Ranged units tire out quickly when firing shots, which can make them easier to catch if they're allowed to get tired enough to the point of speed being significantly reduced, and engaging in melee is tiring as well, though perhaps entirely unavoidable for most units. Managing fatigue isn't necessary at all times, but it can make a difference at the end of a battle, or in particularly dangerous situations when the odds are stacked against you. It is certainly worth considering when outnumbered, or when you're getting into position and figuring out who to engage with what unit and when. It's also worth keeping in mind when recruiting units, as some are immune to the effects of fatigue, and having some of those on hand at times can give you an invisible upper hand that is often overlooked. Picking and using your generals. The heroes and epic heroes in charge of your armies will often be a key factor in your approach for a few reasons. There are 4 classes of heroes, as can be seen on the faction selection screen: Archer, Defender, Fighter, and Warlord, and each of these classes has subclasses: Archer Skirmishers and Tricksters, Defender Protector, Companion, and Veteran, Fighter Champion, Ravager, and Vanquisher, Warlord Mentor, Commander, and Warmonger. Each of these classes and subclasses, as you might expect, excel in different ways, and it's very important to keep that in mind. Sending an Archer or Warlord type hero into melee against a Fighter or Defender isn't going to be a good time, and similarly, baiting enemy heroes into engagements that favor you is an ideal way to tie them down and potentially kill them, causing morale damage across the board for the enemy. Beyond their own classification and stats though, heroes also come with a slew of abilities that can be unlocked as they level up and used to turn the tide of various engagements or an entire battle. These abilities vary based on the class of the hero, and often they can be leveled up for better impact on the battlefield, providing anything from better stats or health replenishment to allied troops, to a way to lock an enemy unit or hero into combat, to buffs to the hero themselves. Sometimes they'll come at a cost though, and you'll need to weigh out those costs versus the benefits being provided. It's extremely important to learn these abilities and learn when to use them. For example, if you can cause fear in an enemy when their morale is already low, you might break them, whereas using that ability prematurely will give you no tangible benefit. On top of all that, you'll want to take into consideration how abilities stack. They will work off of each other, and you'll want to make sure that you're not over-buffing or over-debuffing a specific engagement when you might be better off spreading your support across multiple engagements. Using the abilities is easy. Your heroes will obtain rage over the course of battle. For most, it's gained while fighting, but for some, there are abilities that speed up the process, and for others still, it will steadily tick upwards. When you have enough rage available for an ability, it can be clicked on, and then, depending on the type of ability, you simply have to click on your targeted friendly or enemy unit, or the ground. Some abilities have restrictions, like those that can only be used on another hero, or those that can't be used on mounted troops, and some abilities will affect a radius rather than a single entity, allowing you to affect multiple units rather than just one. Using the ability will drain rage, and then you wait to regain rage again as needed. Finally, heroes have access to Aristia, a temporary, once-per-battle ability that massively improves their abilities for 60 seconds, and can only be accessed by accumulating and using rage abilities multiple times over the course of battle. Try to save this for crucial moments in the battle where the hero needs to dive in and make a real difference, whether that's to save a particularly precious unit, or to kill the enemy hero, or simply to help the hero regenerate some health. Make sure you're patient with this one, as it can make quite the difference when used at the right time, and can feel wasted if used prematurely. Like all tools of the battlefield, your heroes and their abilities are useless if used improperly. The battlefields of Troy are intense affairs, and the challenge isn't to be taken lightly. Your enemies will take advantage of the same tools as you in an attempt to hold you back and destroy you. Hopefully, these key considerations will not only explain what your enemies are doing when they're successful, but will allow you to turn those very same maneuvers and ideas against them. Between these 3 videos, you should have what it takes to start your fight for Helen, but mastery will take time. With that said, it is time to march to war and fight for what you love, because that's what being a great general is about.